Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Canadian Monsters and Mysteries by W. T. Watson. Narrated by Joe Hempel. People everywhere and in every age have been fascinated by monsters. Monsters have peered up from the unknown depths of the oceans, frolicked in lakes and rivers, and jumped out unexpectedly from wildernesses. Betty Garner, Canada's Monsters. Introduction. I moved to Kitchener, Ontario, Canada in the fall of 2020, and almost immediately began to note that this place was different from the areas of the United States where I have lived. At first, the change was barely noticeable. I had spent a lot of time in Canada over the years since my spouse is a native, but as I actually lived here, I began to notice little things that I was not aware of before. It did not matter how cold the weather got. The worst any Canadian would say about the chill was that it was a brisk day. People apologized more, and one seldom encountered anyone belligerent. Homeless people were fewer and farther between. When my spouse sprained an ankle, the hospital staff apologized for charging for a walking boot. Crutches would have been free. People in government who were outed for doing something unethical simply resigned. Little things, but they all added up to make a big difference in my life. Given that my spouse now has a permanent university position, it is doubtful that we will ever return to the States, and I am prepared to retire in Canada, although we may try to find a more moderate climate when that time comes. As a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, it was only natural that I start to explore the world of the paranormal in Canada. Every place has its own unique lore, and as I began to explore, the seeds of this book were planted. One of the first things I stumbled across when I began to research the weird in the Great White North was a website called Canadian Bucket List, where I read an interesting article on monsters in Canada. Of course, I was familiar with Sasquatch and Ogopogo and the Wendigo, but did you know that the native people in the far north tell of a mythical creature that appears to be half orca and half wolf called the aquatic? The beast was said to be a shapeshifter that could appear as a killer whale in the water or as a hybrid wolf-whale on land. One discovered the aquatic by checking for animal tracks near the water. If wolf sign came out of the water or went into the water, then there was an aquatic on the loose. The beast is not too picky about what it eats, and will gobble up both animals and humans that cross its path. If you are interested, the CBC Kids website has some excellent artwork of this mythical creature. This is one of the unknown animals I think I would rather avoid, but seeing one at a respectful distance would be fascinating. The aquatic was interesting, but I also found a legendary creature called the Mahaha. The name says it all, for this far northern demon was said to take the form of a narwhal, polar bear, or orca with fiery red eyes, shades of the phantom black dog. The Mahaha, according to the Curiosity website, was dreaded not for the fact that it would eat you, but rather for the notion that if it caught you, it would tickle you to death. For the tickle-averse, this might be a fate worse than death. Having read about these beings of northern myth, my appetite was whetted, and I started to dig into strange occurrences in Canada. I quickly discovered that I was only going to be able to include a sampling of the high strangeness in my new home, and that is exactly what I have endeavored to do in the sections that follow. In order to limit the size of this text, I had to be very selective. I have chosen not to delve into Canadian haunting stories, for example. The lore of ghosts and hauntings in Canada is dense and would honestly require a book of its own, something I will consider in the future. In like manner, I will not cover the ubiquitous Sasquatch in this book. While the hairy one is certainly a native of Canada, he is being more than adequately covered by some of my fellow Beyond the Fray authors, as well as other well-known and respected writers. I have noted a dearth of coverage in my native province, and may explore that for a future book. I will also not touch on the lore of the Wendigo, since Chad Lewis and his co-author have so ably covered this subject. Lewis and Company relate sightings and stories from Canada and the U.S. in their wonderful book, Wendigo Lore, Monsters, Myths, and Madness, available from Beyond the Fray Publishing. In the lake monster section of the book, I have also chosen not to discuss Champ, the monster of Lake Champlain. Canada is a land of lakes, and I found so many monster sightings across the country that I wanted to focus on some of the lesser-known aquatic monsters in this text, though we will delve into the better-known Ogopogo and Caddy sightings in this book. Even without these staples of monster lore, this book will take you to meet cryptids you may have never encountered before. Is it possible, for example, that relict herds of mammoths roam the far north? This is a possibility that we explore in the cryptid section, along with devil monkeys, giant beavers and snakes, a possible underwater moose, and much more. Nor do I neglect the cryptids of the skies in this text. The listener will encounter thunderbirds and other giant flying things before we turn our attention to one of my favorite mysteries, the Manwolf, and the classic Canadian canine mysteries, the loup-garou and the Waheela. As I noted earlier, Canada is a land of many lakes, and if you listen to the witnesses, it seems that many of those lakes are inhabited by monsters other than the giant snakes we will encounter early in the text. We will analyze a good sampling of witness testimony about lake monsters, and then turn that same lens upon the sea to find that sea monsters seem to be common off both Canada's Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Once we've taken a sample of the cryptids of the land, sea, and sky, we will turn our attention to what the First Nations people of Canada often call little people. Many of the settlers in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland came from the lands of the fairy faith, and their beliefs and the spirits that engendered them seem to have transferred straight to their new homeland. We will talk about legendary interactions with the fairy, as well as more modern fairy sightings and encounters. After dealing with the little people, we'll also examine stories of the shadow people, as well as phantom ships and trains that play a strong part in the lore of the Great White North. No book on mysteries would be complete without a dive into the UFO stories of Canada. There are some fascinating cases to review, including the better-known Shag Harbor and Falcon Lake cases, and a number of others that are not so widely known but perhaps ought to be. It seems that the open spaces and clear night skies in many parts of Canada produce a wide range of UFO sightings and encounters. Finally, we will wind up the book with a collection of Forteana. We will discuss other, lesser-known monster tales, such as a monster seen in the subways of Toronto and a goat man witnessed in northern Saskatchewan. We will discuss accounts of fire spooks and the story of a man who was pursued by lightning even after his death. Finally, we get into even more classic Forteana when we find tales of falls of strange objects, such as frogs, as well as strange disappearances. So, without further ado, let's begin by meeting some of the stranger wildlife of Canada. Chapter 1. Animals Long Past. For those who are holding out hope that the wilds of North America may be hiding a new species of upright ape or a relict hominid, I have good news. Canada is home to a Lazarus species that should give all cryptozoologists hope that a large North American mammal could lie undiscovered in the deep forest. The wood bison, Bison athabasca, is a subspecies of the better-known plains bison. These ruminants are native to Alaska and western Canada. According to an article on the Sunset website, this animal, which weighs between 350 and 1,000 kilograms, 794 to 2,205 pounds, and stands 1.3 to 1.8 meters, 4.27 to 5.91 feet, at the shoulder, was believed to be extinct. The wood bison had supposedly fallen prey to overhunting and habitat destruction, as well as the diseases brucellosis and bovine tuberculosis. Apparently, the wood bison never received the news. In 1957, a wildlife officer discovered a herd of approximately 200 wood bison while flying over a remote section of Wood Buffalo National Park in the province of Alberta. The species is still extant today, with numbers approaching 10,000 individuals. Silent testament to the fact that the largest land animal in North America, wood bison and their cousins beat out the moose due to their weight, could go unnoticed for decades before being rediscovered. While we are speaking of things that are supposed to be extinct, Carl Schuker, in his book On the Search for Prehistoric Survivors, tells us the tale of the beast of Partridge Creek. The story comes to us from French traveler Georges Dupuy. In 1903, San Francisco banker James Lewis Butler and his companion gold prospector Tom Leemore were hunting moose in the Yukon. They spied 3 moose on the marshy tundra, but as they approached, one of the moose raised its head, and another gave voice to a loud alarm call that sent the 3 running breakneck away to the south. Next to the bison, moose are North America's largest land animals, with some specimens standing over 7 feet tall. They are not easily frightened, so the hunters were puzzled by the sudden exodus of their intended prey. When they arrived at the site where they had seen the moose, however, the mystery deepened. There, in the snow, was the clear impression of an enormous body belonging to some unidentifiable beast of monstrous proportions. The beast's belly had plowed into the riverbed's swampy mud a massive furrow 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, which was flanked by gigantic footprints measuring 2.5 feet across and 5 feet in length, each also yielding the impressions of sharp 1-foot-long claws. In addition to all these traces, the creature also left the impression of a huge tail in the mud. The 2 hunters can only be called intrepid. They resolved to follow the track. The pair followed the sign for several miles until it disappeared. The men surmised that the creature, whatever it was, had leapt directly up into the gulch's encompassing cliffs. The 2 hunters made their way via canoe to a place called Armstrong Creek, a First Nation settlement where they met up with Dupuy and a Roman Catholic priest, Pierre Laveneau. The 2 new members of the party were, not surprisingly, skeptical of the story, so the original members of the hunting expedition took Dupuy and the priest, along with some local natives, out to the area where they had seen the monster trackway. As often happens in these cryptozoological stories, the hunters were unable to find the tracks again. The story might have ended there if the entire party hadn't encountered the thing that seemed to have made the trackway. The men camped at the top of a rocky ravine, and were busily trying to make a warm meal after a long day of monster hunting, when the Arctic stillness was shattered by a hideous roar. Coming up the slope toward the hunters was a black creature, estimated at 50 feet in length, which paused about 200 paces away from the paralyzed party so that they had ample time to observe it. The hide was spattered with mud, but seemed to have bristles like those of a wild boar, while the mouth lay open with a mass of blood and saliva in the corner. The beast had a rhino-like horn on its nose. The priest had no hesitation in identifying the creature as Ceratosaurus, a bipedal carnivore of the Jurassic era. Almost as if on cue, the beast gave voice to another ear-splitting roar, as it reared up on its hind legs and then vanished back into the ravine in a single bound. As one might expect, the hunters decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and decamped that morning, heading back for civilization. As with all good stories, however, this one does not end in Armstrong Creek when the hunters part ways. Dupuy tried to interest the Canadian governor of the region in a large-scale hunting party to go after the creature, but when he was rebuffed, he returned to France. In 1908, just after the turn of the year, Dupuy received a letter from Father Laveneau informing him that the priest, along with 10 First Nations men, had seen the dinosaur again. This time, the creature was racing at speed over the creek's frozen river, with what seemed to be the carcass of a caribou clamped between its great jaws. Tracks identical to those found back in 1903 were clearly visible in the deep mud and were followed by Laveneau and his companions for at least 2 miles before being obliterated by falling snow. This was the last that was heard of this creature, as far as we know. But I find this story interesting for several reasons. First, how on earth would a dinosaur, even a bristly one like the one described, survive in the Yukon, an area that is frozen for a good part of the year? And if we follow this thought forward, how would a whole breeding population of these giant reptiles manage in such an inhospitable climate? There are some theories that dinosaurs may not have been cold-blooded, but even so, mammals struggle to survive in the Arctic winter. I would think that a reptile, even a warm-blooded one, would favor a warmer climate. Of course, these episodes could be time anomalies or examples of the thinning of the veil that I have discussed in my other books. More on that thought later. Lest the listener think that the Ceratosaurus story is a one-off, we also have the short but intriguing story of Kevin Meixner, found in Philip O'Donnell's Dinosaurs, Dead or Alive? Meixner, who lived in Brampton, Ontario at the time of the sighting, states that he saw a small pterosaur with a wingspan of about 4 feet. The creature was about 20 feet away from him at the time of the event, and Meixner recalled that the little creature had a distinct tail with a diamond-shaped flange at the end. The odd detail of the tail seems to rule out the misidentification of a bird as the cause of this sighting. Interestingly, Meixner comments that he felt privileged to see this animal and that it was a wonderful experience. We see so many examples of people being traumatized by sightings that it is nice to read one where the witness actually enjoyed the event. Dinosaurs are not the only extinct creatures said to live in Canada. In his book, Mysterious Encounters, John Colombo tells us that the great explorer David Thompson encountered the Piegan, members of the Blackfoot Confederacy now known as the Piikani. Talking with these native people on the shores of a river in what is now Alberta, Thompson was told tales of gigantic beasts, and he even referred to them as mammoths. Thompson became convinced of the truth of these legends on the 7th of January, 1811, when he and his guides came across an enormous set of tracks. The explorer described the tracks as, "of a large animal, the snow about 6 inches deep on the ice. I measured it. 4 large toes, each of 4 inches in length to each a short claw. The ball of the foot sank 3 inches lower than the toes. The hinder part of the foot did not mark well. The length 14 inches by 8 inches in breadth, walking from north to south, having passed about 6 hours." While Thompson wanted to claim that the trackway belonged to a large grizzled bear, he writes in his journal that he knew it was not so, and that the local natives identified the track as belonging to a mammoth. Notably, no one, not Thompson or his native guides, wanted to follow this trackway. Thompson returned to the site of this incident in October of that year and, according to Colombo, actually saw the creature. Unfortunately, that section of Thompson's journal is not quoted, so we will have to time travel to 2008 for some confirmation of a decidedly paranormal kind. This story comes to us from Nick Redfern's Monster Diary and technically occurs in Alaska. However, the site of the event is the Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve. Mount St. Elias is actually on the border of Alaska and the Yukon area of Canada, and on the 18th of September 2008, Jill O'Brien was setting up her camera, trying to get a good shot of the mountain, when she heard a funny crunching and thudding on the ground. When the witness turned to see what was making the noise, she was astonished to see a small mammoth, maybe 4 feet in height, running past her. The animal seemed aware of her presence before it disappeared in a small black cloud of smoke that sucked into itself and was gone. In my book Mysteries in the Mist, I note the presence of fog, mist, clouds, and smoke in a significant number of paranormal cases, and detail cases in which these mystery fogs were involved with cases of teleportation and disappearance. In my mind, after the research for that book, It is not a long jump to believe that Ms. O'Brien encountered some sort of time distortion that was signaled by this black smoke. And if it is possible for an extinct creature to disappear into one of these mists, then it certainly seems possible that the same creature, or an adult version, could come through that way. Whether these creatures are appearing from our past, or still exist on another timeline or in another dimension, it certainly seems that they occasionally blunder into our world, and then go back again. Chapter 2. Animals that don't belong. There are some creatures that we know exist in the wild, but that puzzle us when they appear in unexpected places. One of the best known of these out-of-place animals is the so-called Black Panther. In his book, Shadow Cats, author Michael Mays details many sightings of black panthers and other mystery cats throughout North America, focusing on his native United States. However, Mays does cite an interesting report that has a bearing on the subject of mystery cat sightings in Canada. Mays states that between 1991 and 2010, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources conducted an extensive study aimed at determining whether wild cougars, Puma concolor, still existed in rural Ontario. According to Mays, evidence collected included scat, hair, DNA, tracks, and photographs. In addition, there were more than 470 sightings recorded, including some by highly qualified observers such as biologists. In other words, the study was a fairly extensive undertaking, and, at its conclusion, determined that there were cougars, also known as mountain lions, in the wilds of Ontario. Even more interesting, though, is the fact that the study's authors noted 52 credible sightings of black cougars during the course of their evidence gathering. Black is not a color known to exist amongst cougars, so the scientists, in typical fashion, labeled all these black cougars as melanistic jaguars, Panthera onca, or melanistic leopards, Panthera pardus. The report even included a photograph of what was referred to as a melanistic jaguar taken near Guelph, Ontario, in April of 2010. I found this extremely interesting since Guelph is about 30 minutes from my home in Kitchener. The study authors offered no explanation for the presence of these cats in Canada. As seems to happen often in the realms of cryptozoology, scientists are unwilling to look at evidence that does not fit their pre-existing notions. It seems to me that 52 individual sightings would need to be accounted for by some event other than the old "they escaped from the zoo/circus/exotic animal breeder" excuse. This is especially true when we travel in time back to the 1st of March 1941 and realize that these sightings were happening well before the 1991 study. Loren Coleman, in his epic Mysterious America, gives us the story of a group of teamsters in New Brunswick who were engaged in hauling logs when a large panther stopped the progress of their wagon by the simple exigency of sitting in the middle of the road. This beast was not black, but was described as a yellow-gray-reddish color with longer hair around its head that gave it a maned appearance. As you might expect, the horses drawing the wagon were terrified. But after a time, this maned panther simply strolled off the road and went on its way. It is quite odd enough to see a large mystery cat, even a black one. But what are we to make of the description of this animal? A maned, yellow-gray-reddish cat of considerable size that intimidated both horses and the men who drove them. As Michael Mays might say, a shadow cat indeed. In more recent times, Cryptomundo reported that the presence of a black panther was noticed in the Lac George area of Alfred Plantagenet, Ontario, not far from Ottawa. According to the Ottawa Citizen, a witness reported to the Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, that he had seen a big black panther on the 30th of June 2010. The animal had been sighted on Lac George Road, and the OPP took the report seriously enough to check the area. As so often happens, the police found nothing, But the article did note that others in the area told police they had spotted a similar animal over the past 3 years, but never reported the sighting. In one of those interesting slips by a law enforcement officer, Hawkesbury OPP Constable Pierre Dubois is supposed to have said that black cougars do exist, but are extremely rare. This would be news to the zoological community, since scientists have long completely denied the existence of melanistic cougars, putting sightings down to black jaguars or leopards. CBC News, in an article dated the 6th of October 2017, cited this social media report from the town of Deer Lake, Newfoundland. 2 Deer Lake women have had a close encounter of the cat kind on Glidebrook Road. Linda Roberts and Tammy Beck were walking on the road on Sunday, October 1st, when they spotted the black cat. Linda reported the incident to the Wildlife Division. She described the panther as having rounded ears, a muscular cat body, and a very long, thick, rope-like black curled tail. This wasn't Linda's first encounter with a panther, as she and her husband Wayne saw one on the Pinsbrook Road in early September. Residents are asked to use extreme caution when walking in any area outside the town. The town apparently took this report a lot more seriously than the Wildlife Division of the Department of Fisheries and Land Resources, which simply stated that there had been a number of panther sightings over the previous years, but that they had not confirmed any of them. Perhaps if they had left their offices, they might have been surprised. The CBC News article goes on to cite journalist Gary Keane, who stated that he had covered several black panther sightings in western Newfoundland. One of the witnesses was the owner of a daycare in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, who claimed to see a panther-like cat behind his business. This sighting was followed a few weeks later by tourists reporting the same exact sort of cat as they were passing through Corner Brook. While we don't get a lot of description of this large cat, as Keane notes, the creature made enough of an impression on the witnesses for them to report the incidents. I find it particularly spooky that the creature was seen in the vicinity of a daycare. While we do not know the habits of mystery cats, it is true that mountain lions are known to attack small children. In another report from Mysterious America, we encounter an entirely different sort of large cat roaming Ontario. In June 1960, near Kapuskasing, Ontario, witness Leopold Dallaire claimed to see a very out-of-place animal, an African lion. You might recognize this beast from the description. It was light tan in color, had a distinct mane, stood 3 feet tall, and was at least 5 feet long with a 4-foot tail tipped at the end with a tuft of fur. The local wildlife officer, in typical fashion, commented that Dallaire had been watching too much television. There is no record of Dallaire's response to the wildlife officer. I might have been rather tart had I been in his shoes. Oddly, this is not the only lion sighting in Canada. Lauren Coleman also tells us that guide M. MacDonald spotted a creature that looked exactly like an African lion near Magundy Stream in New Brunswick on the 20th of October 1964. MacDonald described the beast as a big, very dark brown cat with a long tail. Even if we shake our heads and state definitively that Dallaire and MacDonald could not have seen a lion, since lions do not live in Canada, we still must ask ourselves, what did they see? Whatever it was, it had to be big enough and feline enough to make the witnesses believe they had seen a lion. There are no cats native to Canada that are that large. Another report from New Brunswick is even stranger than the above. Jerome Clark, in his book Unexplained, tells the story of a witness in Queens County dated the 22nd of November 1951. The witness states that he was coming home at about 1800 hours. He came across a pole fence and gave it a whack with his axe before crossing it. I wonder if this was a local superstition. There seems to be no reason for this action. As he proceeded, he heard 5 loud yells off in the woods. The witness went on his way, but after he had traveled a short distance, he heard more yells and then turned to see that he was being pursued by something. The thing caught up to the witness, and he turned to fight. To his astonishment, the being reared up on its back legs and came at him, swinging its front paws. The witness swung his axe at the creature, and it backed off into the woods, only to approach him again as he made a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?